Welcome. In a previous video, I put together a budget ITX gaming PC. I've now got that PC plugged into my TV, and I've done some testing on it, and I'm not quite happy with the performance. I feel like I've got a little bit extra headroom to do some overclocking. So that's the subject of this video. We're going to be looking at doing some basic tweaking of the computer and a little bit of basic overclocking. This is a budget PC build, and so for the CPU I'm running an i3-12100F, and for the GPU I'm running an RTX 2060. For the full build, you can go ahead and check out my previous video where I give a detailed explanation about all the parts that I chose. In order to do a before and after comparison, I'm going to be running 2 benchmarks and then trying out 3 games and recording how much FPS I get and what kind of scores I get. In order to test the CPU, I'm using Cinebench R23. I'm using Heaven to test out the GPU. And then we're going to be running Halo, which is a pretty GPU intensive game. Diablo 2 Resurrected, which is somewhere in the middle for CPU and GPU stress. And then we're going to be running Valorant, which is a mostly CPU stressing game. Now before we get into overclocking, we're just going to go and make sure that our Windows is set up appropriately for high-speed gaming. And one setting that might get overlooked is the power options. So if we just go into the power options in Windows, we're just going to make sure that we're set to either the high performance or extreme performance option to make sure our CPU is running at maximum speed. Next, let's make sure that we've got the latest drivers installed from either NVIDIA or AMD. And then we're going to go into our task manager and we're going to make sure that any unnecessary programs are not running. So what I like to do is just go to the Startup tab, find things like Steam and any other programs you don't really need, and disable them. The only thing I really run is the Windows anti-malware software and any RGB software I need. Just disable those and then restart the computer. So now let's get into some actual overclocking, and luckily for us, Intel has pretty much done all the hard work for us. In order to increase our RAM speed, and if you haven't already done this, the easy thing to do is restart your computer, hold down your delete key or your F10 key, depending on the motherboard, in order to go into your BIOS. And you just want to enable XMP. And what that'll do is unlock the extreme memory profile from Intel. And in this case, all I'm going to be doing is just enabling that and just going with the basic stock settings. I'm not going to be going into the advanced settings and trying to play around with the different timings, although that is something you could do if you really wanted to try and get the absolute maximum performance out of your system. So what I've done is I've enabled XMP, and then my RAM is actually rated at 3600 megahertz, but I'm just going in and changing it to 3200 megahertz just to kind of keep things as stable as possible. I don't want to do an aggressive overclock here. But if you're going to do this, all you got to do is go in, enable XMP. You want to choose XMP1. That's generally preferable for gaming. And then for just a little bit of background, the first number, so 3200, 2400 megahertz, that's your mega transfers per second. Higher is better in that case. And then the numbers that come after that are your timings. And you want the fastest possible timings. In other words, the lowest numbers are preferable in that case. So once you've enabled XMP, you can go ahead and save and exit. And then, assuming that everything went well, you should immediately start to see a slight increase in performance. It's one of the easiest things that you can do to get a little bit more out of your PC, and I definitely recommend it. So we finished overclocking the RAM, and now we're going to overclock the graphics card to try and get a little bit higher frame rates. I won't go into too much detail because there are other YouTube content creators that have done a much better job explaining exactly how this works. But if you're new to overclocking and you want to give it a try, it's usually a safe thing to do, and it's a little bit counterintuitive here, but you want to actually raise your power limit as high as it will go. That'll give you the best stability possible. And then what you want to do is use MSI's built-in OC scanner tool. and you just let that run. It takes maybe 20 to 30 minutes, and then it'll come up with numbers for you to use. So when I ran it, the numbers that I was given to use by the scanner, and it should be pretty stable, was plus 78 megahertz on the core clock. And so I ended up just going with plus 75 because it's a nice round number, and it said 200 megahertz on the memory clock. That's very conservative. You can actually go a lot higher, maybe plus 500, 800. I've even seen people say they can go up 1,000 megahertz on the memory clock. But I just want to do a nice and stable overclock. So what I did was I just used the recommended numbers at first. I did plus 75, plus 200. And then I ran a bunch of benchmarks and tests to make sure that everything was stable. And once I realized that it was, I decided to put the memory clock up to an additional 450 megahertz, so 450 in total. So as you can see, overclocking your RAM and your GPU is relatively easy if you're willing to just go with basically the stock settings and use MSI's tool. And the advantage to doing that also is that it's very stable, although you could probably get a little bit higher performance by really digging into it and spending a lot of time. Just doing it this way is an easy way to get a little bit of higher frame rates. And I did see some higher frame rates for the most part with doing this overclock. So let's take a look at the results. First, Cinebench R32. Didn't really see much of a change here, but that is expected. Cinebench R32 is very much dependent on the brute force of the processor, and there's no real way to overclock that with the type of motherboard that I am using, which is a locked CPU and no overclocking capability on the motherboard. So for Cinebench R32, the stock result for multi-core was 8,440 for the score. After overclocking, the result was 8,464, so basically the same result with a slight increase. Ditto for single core, the stock result was 1,659 score, and after overclocking, the score was 1,664. That's about a 0.3% increase. Next up, we're looking at Unigine Heaven. This is a DirectX 11 test, and I was running it in 1440p on high settings. Stock, the result was a score of 3,118 and an average FPS of 123.8. And after overclocking, the score increased to 3,283, and the average FPS went up to 130.3. That's a little over a 5% increase, so not bad for about a half hour or so of work. Moving on to the games, taking a look at Halo Infinite, which is like my main reason for even wanting to overclock in the first place. I'm running Halo Infinite also in 1440p on medium settings. Just running it stock, the result was that I saw an average FPS of 54.5 and a 1% low of 27.3. After overclocking, I didn't quite hit my 60 FPS goal, but it did improve a bit. I'm now getting an average FPS of 57.7 and a 1% low of 29.1. That's about a 6% increase overall. For Diablo 2 Resurrected, I actually saw some really good results. I'm running Diablo 2 also in 1440p on high settings, and originally I got an average FPS of 99.6 and a 1% low of 77.4. And after overclocking, I saw a pretty big jump, getting an average FPS of 107.8 and a 1% low of 87.3. That's representing about an 8 and a 12% increase, so pretty nice little jump there. On the other hand, for Valorant, I saw some interesting results. I'm running Valorant actually in 4K on high settings. Originally, I had very high frame rates, so 420.9 FPS and a 1% low of 267.4. After overclocking, my results actually went down a bit to 399.8 FPS average and a 1% low of 259.6. Some of this could be simply due to my testing methodology, which was just very simple, try to run the same part of the level over and over and just test it and just see how it came out. Some of this also could be down to memory errors or something. I do think that this is probably worthy of a little bit more testing to see what is going on with this. But overall, I'm pretty pleased with the results from the overclocking, and it was actually a pretty successful test. So that's all for now, and thank you for watching.